Morning mist clung to the surface of Lake Superior as Malcolm Greene guided his weathered fishing boat through the calm waters. Third-generation fisherman from Toronto, Malcolm preferred the American side of the Great Lakes for its abundant whitefish. This season, his 20-foot vessel, faded blue paint and nets mended more times than he could count, cut a modest wake across the glassy surface. Malcolm checked his depth finder, an ancient model he'd inherited from his father, and adjusted. Course slightly, he knew these waters like the lines on his sun-weathered face, each ripple and current telling its own story. His practiced hands worked the lines as he prepared to check his first nets of the day. The distant roar of powerful engines broke the morning stillness. Malcolm glanced up, squinting against the rising sun to see a gleaming white 40-foot fishing vessel approaching fast, American flag whipping proudly from its stern. The boat's chrome fittings reflected sunlight like flashes of lightning as it cut through the water, stereo blasting country music across the open lake. The vessel, Lake Dominator, emblazoned on its hull in aggressive red lettering, slowed as it approached, its wake rocking Malcolm's smaller boat. 3 men stood at the bow, designer sunglasses and matching branded fishing shirts making them look more like models from a catalog than actual fishermen. "Hey there, old-timer," the tallest one called out, his Michigan accent thick with mockery. "Museum let you take that antique out for a spin today?" The others laughed, one of them pointing at Malcolm's hand-repaired nets. "Man, my grandfather had better equipment than that, and he's been dead 20 years. Malcolm just nodded politely, continuing his work. The captain leaned over the side, smirking. "Hope you're not planning to catch much with that piece of junk. We'd hate to leave you with nothing but empty nets." Malcolm kept his eyes on his work, decades of patience evident in every deliberate movement. The Lake Dominator circled his position, its crew growing bolder with each pass. "This is prime fishing territory, Grandpa," called the captain, a man in his 30s named Brett according to the monogrammed shirt he wore. "Maybe stick to the kiddie pools near shore where you belong." His vessel cut closer to Malcolm's, forcing the Canadian to quickly adjust his course to avoid a collision. The American boat was equipped with every modern advantage: digital fish finders, GPS-guided positioning systems, and hydraulic net retrieval mechanisms worth more than Malcolm's entire boat. "Look at this," Brett announced to his crew, holding up a tablet displaying a sonar readout. "There's a massive school right beneath us. Cut that old-timer off from the eastern approach." The Americans maneuvered aggressively, positioning their boat to block Malcolm's access to the deeper waters. They deployed their nets with mechanical efficiency, the hydraulic whir of their equipment drowning out the natural sounds of the lake. Malcolm watched silently as they encroached further into the area he'd planned to fish. He'd been working these waters for 40 years, navigating by instinct and knowledge passed down through generations. The Americans relied on technology and brute force, treating fishing like a conquest rather than a conversation with nature. $10 says the old man catches nothing but lake trash today," one of the crew members laughed, loud enough to carry across the water. Malcolm simply turned his boat northward, adjusting his plans without complaint. He checked the sky, noted the subtle shift in the wind, and felt the almost imperceptible change in the water's temperature with his fingertips. Brett leaned against his boat's gleaming rail. "By the time we're done, you'll be lucky to have a single fish left in your net. Maybe time to retire that floating museum exhibit." By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly on the open water. The Lake Dominator's crew had settled into a rhythm, their high-tech equipment doing most of the work as they lounged on deck chairs, drinking beer and checking their phones between net retrievals. "First haul of the day coming up," Brett announced, activating the hydraulic system that pulled their nets from the depths. The mechanisms hummed efficiently as the dripping nets broke the surface, revealing a decent catch of whitefish and lake trout thrashing in the mesh. "That's how it's done, old-timer," called one of the crew members, Jake, as they began emptying the fish into their industrial-sized holding tanks. 67 fish in one go. What did you catch so far? A cold?" Malcolm, positioned 100 yards away, continued his methodical work. He'd moved to a seemingly unpromising area, shallow and close to a rocky formation most commercial fishermen avoided. His hands worked with practiced precision, adjusting his lines and checking the water conditions. Continuously. He hadn't yet pulled in a single net. Brett guided his vessel closer to Malcolm's position, their massive wake deliberately rocking the smaller boat. "Hey, museum piece, you even planning to catch anything today, or just out for a scenic tour?" Malcolm nodded toward the eastern horizon. "Weather's changing." The Americans looked up at the clear blue sky, then erupted in laughter. "Weather's perfect, Grandpa. Maybe get your eyes checked along with upgrading your equipment." Malcolm shrugged, continuing to position his nets in a pattern that seemed random to the untrained eye. He checked his watch, made a notation in a tattered notebook, and turned his attention to the lake's surface, studying it like a text only he could read. Jake leaned over the railing, pointing his beer bottle at Malcolm. "You even catching anything over there, Grandpa? Or just pretending to fish?" For the first time that day, Malcolm straightened his back and looked directly at the Americans. His voice, when it finally came, carried across the water with quiet authority despite its softness. "My grandfather taught me that fish don't respond to noise and showing off," he said. "They respond to understanding. These waters have patterns stranger than your computers can read." Brett rolled his eyes dramatically for his crew's benefit. "Listen to the fishing philosopher. Our sonar can track individual fish 30 meters down, but please tell us more about your understanding of the water." Malcolm simply nodded and returned to his work. He checked his watch again, then moved to a specific spot he'd been preparing all morning. The Americans had been so busy mocking him they hadn't noticed how he'd been setting a careful trap, positioning his boat precisely where the underwater currents converged near the rocky formation. The subtle shift in the water's texture, invisible to technology but clear to Malcolm's experienced eye, told him everything he needed to know. A flock of gulls began circling overhead, another sign the Americans completely missed while checking their electronic readouts. Malcolm began pulling in his first net with unhurried movements. The old manual winch creaked rhythmically as the net broke the surface. There was something different about the way it moved in the water, heavier, straining against the winch. Brett noticed the change in Malcolm's activity. Finally, giving up and going home, the Canadian's net emerged from the depths, water cascading from its edges as it revealed its contents, a writhing, silver mass of whitefish, more densely packed than seemed possible for a net that size. Malcolm met Brett's stunned gaze across the water and allowed himself the smallest smile. "Looks like it's my turn." Malcolm worked methodically, his weathered hands steady as he pulled in net after net. Each one came up bursting with fish, lake trout, whitefish, and even some prized walleye. The shallow, rocky area the Americans had dismissed was actually a hidden feeding ground, invisible to electronic equipment but known to fishermen who understood the lake's secrets. Brett's jovial mood evaporated as he watched the Canadian's haul grow. "Lucky shot," he muttered, then turned to his crew. "Get the secondary nets in the water now. Eastern quadrant." The Americans scrambled to reposition their boat, their earlier relaxed attitude replaced by frantic activity. Jake furiously tapped at the fish finder's controls, scanning for the schools Malcolm was somehow intercepting. "Nothing on sonar in his area," Jake reported, confusion evident in his voice. "How is he pulling that many fish from empty water?" Malcolm continued his harvest, each movement precise and economical. Decades of experience had taught him how the subtle change in barometric pressure preceding an approaching weather system drove certain species to congregate in these protected pockets, knowledge no technology could replace. 2 other fishing. Boats had noticed the commotion and drawn closer. Their crews watched with quiet amusement as the mighty Lake Dominator rushed to match the old Canadian's catch. The Americans deployed their most advanced lures and nets, their hydraulic systems, working at maximum capacity. "We're commercial fishermen with state-of-the-art equipment," Brett growled, slamming his hand against the control panel. "We can't be outfished by some old man in a floating relic." But with each passing minute, Malcolm's pile of gleaming fish grew while the Americans struggled to match even half his catch. Their frantic movements and loud cursing contrasted sharply with the Canadians' calm efficiency. One of the American crewmen stared in disbelief at Malcolm's overflowing hold. "No way! How is he doing that?" The afternoon wore on as Malcolm continued. His extraordinary harvest. His small boat now sat noticeably lower in the water, weighted down by a catch that would have been impressive for a vessel twice its size. He worked without haste but without wasted motion, each movement refined by years of practice. The Lake Dominator's crew had abandoned all pretense of confidence. Brett paced the deck, barking orders and checking their fish finder repeatedly. They'd repositioned 3 times, deployed every type of net and lure in their extensive arsenal, yet their hold remained half empty. "What's he using for bait?" demanded Brett, training binoculars on Malcolm's boat. "There must be something we're missing." "Maybe he knows something we don't," suggested the youngest crewman, earning a sharp glare from Brett. "He's just a dinosaur." "With outdated equipment, there's no way he should be out fishing us." A small gathering of boats had formed a respectful distance away, word spreading quickly among the fishing community about the quiet Canadian putting the arrogant Americans in their place. Several captured photos and videos on their phones, documenting what was quickly becoming a legendary moment on the lake. Malcolm began securing his catch and preparing to head back to harbor. The day's work complete, he seemed entirely unconcerned with the spectacle he'd created. He didn't gloat or make a show of his success. The overflowing hold of premium fish spoke eloquently enough. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. The modest boat brimming with fish beside the gleaming, expensive vessel with its meager catch. Natural skill had thoroughly trumped technology and bravado. Brett stared at the Canadian's departing boat, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. His voice, when he finally spoke, was barely audible even to his crew. "This can't be real." The Lake Dominator fell silent as Malcolm prepared to depart. The American crew watched him work, their earlier mockery replaced by reluctant fascination. Brett stood motionless at the helm, his expensive fishing gear forgotten as he tried to process what had happened. "Should we ask him?" Jake finally ventured, his voice hushed. "Ask him how he did it." Brett didn't respond, his pride still wrestling with the undeniable evidence before him. The other boats nearby made no effort to hide their amusement, several captains offering Malcolm respectful nods or thumbs-up gestures. "Tommy's dad said he's been fishing these waters for 40 years, the youngest crewman whispered. "Said his family's been fishing here since before GPS or sonar existed." Malcolm secured the last of his catch and checked his boat one final time. As he prepared to start his engine, he glanced over at the Americans. Something in their defeated postures seemed to touch him, and he guided his boat closer to theirs. "Storm. Coming in from the northwest," he called across the water. "Barometric pressure's been dropping since dawn. Fish feel it before we do. They gather in the protected pockets near those rock formations." He gestured toward the area he'd been fishing. "Your equipment's looking for deep water schools, but today they're all hugging the shallows." The Americans stared at him, processing this simple explanation that no technology had detected. "The lake speaks if you listen long enough," Malcolm added with a small smile. "No disrespect to your fine equipment, but some things you learn through time, not technology." Malcolm's engine sputtered to life, the sound somehow dignified despite its age. As he turned his boat toward harbor, Brett finally found his voice. "Maybe we should have listened to him after all." Malcolm's boat cut through the afternoon light, its wake a straight line back toward Whitefish Bay Harbor. The American crew watched him go, their earlier bravado washed away like footprints on a shoreline. "Should we follow him in?" asked Jake, still stunned by the day's turn of events. Brett didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the Canadian's departing vessel. Finally, he nodded. Yeah, not much point staying out here now. The Lake Dominator's powerful engines roared to life, but somehow the sound seemed hollow compared to the dignified putt-putt of Malcolm's aging motor. As they followed at a respectful distance, the other fishing boats nearby offered knowing. Smiles and occasional waves, silent acknowledgement of the humbling they'd witnessed. At the harbor, Malcolm unloaded his extraordinary catch with the same quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did. Several buyers approached him immediately, eager to secure the premium fish. The Americans docked nearby, their meager haul barely worth the fuel they'd burned. Brett found himself drawn to watch as Malcolm completed his transactions and prepared to leave. When the Canadian passed by the Lake Dominator on his way to his truck, Brett swallowed his pride and called out, "Hey, think you could show us those spots sometime?" Malcolm paused, studying the younger man's face. After a moment, he nodded. "Lakes. Got room for everyone willing to listen to what it's saying." He glanced at their expensive equipment. "All that technology's useful, but it can't replace knowing the water." With a friendly nod, Malcolm continued on his way, disappearing among the harbor buildings as if he were just any other fisherman completing a day's work, not someone who had just delivered a master class in humility and true skill. Brett turned back to his gleaming, expensive boat with new eyes. "Turns out, the lake doesn't care how big your boat is, only how well you know it.